liked Baba stories, and especially how people came to Baba. And I immediately went into rebellion, and I said, but that's just sort of cream puff pleasure. After all, they're fascinating stories, but what does that do to push people along as far as their own personal relationship and their own inner life with Baba is concerned? So, you see, having said that vigorously, you can tackle me now on that subject. No, anybody. I know that Baba stories are enchanting and they're a lot of fun. I sometimes think, however, that we do spend so much time with different people's recountings that lots of times people don't have any time or any energy or even perhaps any incentive to get into what Baba himself has said about creation, what we're all doing here, and how we get on with the job that has to be done. So then Ned said, well, what about talking a little bit about the discourses? And I've had my nose so thoroughly to the grindstone on discourses for about 20 years now that I got a little bit of mental fatigue even thinking about it. But incidentally, one project might possibly interest you. When I went back over to England in 1968, they started up for the first time in England a permanent center. And so as one of the activities there, I offered to do a regular weekly study group in the discourses. I think there were perhaps, 25, 35 people who worked for 5 solid years every week on the discourses till we got to the end of it. And at the end of that time, in fact, even before we finally got completely through the discourses, a number of the group decided that they would like to tackle God Speaks. But after about 2, maybe 3 years of that, they got mental fatigue, and so that subject was put aside. The group disbanded for about a year, and then about 2/3 of the people said, well, we need some sort of a focal point in our life that relates to Baba. Can't we reform the group and take up some subject directly related with Baba again?
I would appreciate it sometime in the evening. I know it's appropriate now.
Interrupt any old time and just toss whatever you'd like into the pot. I love it.
Your personal feelings about doubts. See, I have a problem about doubts. You know?
Who doesn't?
If you share where you are with that. Do you have doubts?
Well, I had 7 years of doubts. Lots of them. I guess maybe I'm almost the world's MeherBaba specialist in doubts. And that'd be a good subject, incidentally, to tackle. But I'll just finish off the little story about that original discourse group in London. When they came to me and said, well, can't we reorganize and pick some sort of a topic? I guess I was probably a little bit selfish, or maybe very selfish, and certainly very blunt, and said immediately, well, the only thing, quite frankly, that interests me at this point is interrelatedness with Baba in one's daily life. I said, now, if you people are interested in that, if that seems of great importance to you, then I'm perfectly willing to pitch in and work along and see where we get together on it. So they all sort of looked at each other, and am I talking loud enough for you over in the corner? Because sometimes I talk a little bit silently, and I hear a little magpieing going on out in the kitchen, so I'm not sure. No, don't worry about me, Ned. I'm just worried about you, whether you hear. So they said, well, but what else is of importance? And so the group reformed at that point. We all sat down and said, well, how does one go about inner relatedness to Baba in daily life? And no one at that particular moment had any panacea, any formula that they could toss into the pot. But different people said, well, I seem to remember so maybe we'd get some clues out of that. And what about the new life? Would that have some clues? Because Baba apparently was laying down the blueprint for the new humanity, for the avatar Meher Baba period. And so everybody says, oh yes, we should tackle the new life. And what about surrenderance and one-pointedness and concentration and focus and things of that sort? So we added them to the agenda. So that particular group that started 10 years ago on Baba's discourses is still meeting regularly, pushing, and the experiences, now that they have been focusing for about 3 years on their own interrelatedness to Baba, related to their everyday life, what has been happening in terms of developing a real sense, an immediacy of Baba has been quite extraordinary. So, at any rate, I did want to tell you that Ned suggested the discourses, and that reminded me of this group, which has been typical of one type of attack or approach to make Baba real, to apply him in one's own personal life. I think that this question of one's own relationship to Baba, I doubt very much that except for Ned and myself that there's anybody in the room who did meet Baba in the flesh. This must present a considerable question mark for most people. So this might just possibly be something that you'd also like to get into this evening. How does one go about Baba? What are the relative advantages or disadvantages of different approaches? There are a lot of people you know who say, oh, to hell with words and intellectualism, even if it's Baba's words. We just don't cotton to that sort of a thing. It's too superficial on the surface. What we want to do is dive deep into feeling for Baba. I know a number of people, for instance, who work on projects, creative projects, which they feel are deeply related to Baba, and this is the way that they relate internally to Baba. I know others who get absolutely horrified at the thought of any sort of group activity, and they shy away from even meeting another person who is known to be another Baba lover. About the only time you ever run across their trail is on maybe some extraordinary occasion when somebody who had lived close to Baba for a whole lifetime happens to come along. Yes.
Example of a specific example of creative project?
Well, I think it's very easy. For instance, the Society in New York have done music and motion pictures. Just very typically beautiful creative projects, and the manner in which they as a group, as a whole, focus, go through all sorts of problems, arguments, fights, creative brainstorms, and so on. There's a tremendous ferment in the focus on Baba that goes on, and very, very practical activities. There are quite a few people, as you well know, who write absolutely magnificent music, who perform, record. There are a number of people also who write superb poetry, prose poetry related to Baba. Were you about to say something, Dan?
Yeah, I got something to say.
Yes.
We should contrast your extreme feelings of doubt at one time, or your most extreme feelings of doubt, with the point at which
All right. Since you both raised the point, why don't we just jump right into the middle of that one? Will you forgive me if I'm terribly blunt and honest with you about this question? I know what one is supposed to do at this point is look at a lot of smiling faces and reinforce all of your firm beliefs rather than talk about the doubting things. But you know, really, I don't think that there is an individual who ever comes across an important topic in his life, let alone Meher Baba, where there aren't enormous doubts that are involved. And you can't just butter them up and pretend they aren't there. You have to dive if you're going to form any sort of a sound basis for your future ongoing in that field or with that individual. So, let us say this. I first knew of the subject of Meher Baba in about 1944. At any rate, I'd been initiated as a Sufi by Inayat Khan's first initiate in the Western world, Murshid Rabia Martin in San Francisco, and had studied several years under her. One day, she sent out a notice to her students in California. She was the Murshid, incidentally, for North America, South America, and Australia, and with a certain confusion as to whether Western Europe was included in that or not. So she sent out to her immediate close-at-hand students a notification they should come to her home for a special meeting. When we came there, in her home in San Francisco, she recounted that, according to the Sufi tradition, that since the death of her master, Murshid Inayat Khan, in 1928, she had spent the intervening years looking for another master to continue her teaching. Eventually, she had run across two ladies in New York, Elizabeth Patterson and Princess Nerina Machiavelli. And through them, she had been made aware that there was a great teacher in the world by the name of Meher Baba. She had spent 2 years then talking a great deal with him, reading and studying the works that Meher Baba had written or had given out up to that point. And she told us that she had come to the conclusion after these 2 years that this was the great spiritual master of the age. I think those are almost her identical words. She had, as a consequence, decided that she would place herself and her order under his guidance, his direction. Imagine, this woman was, perhaps 72 years old at the time. The tremendous flexibility and the tremendous decision that she took. Every time I think about it, I admire her guts, her courage. So, what did she do? She was a good Leo, incidentally. And you all know the characteristics of Leo. They get on with it, and sometimes even possibly a tiny bit belligerently. So she said, no, I'm convinced of this. And in the next 2 or 3 days, both Elizabeth Patterson and Nerina Machiavelli are going to be in San Francisco. So I invite you all to come up to the summer school at Fairfax, just in the North Peninsula, and listen to them. And after that, I give you each 2 weeks to decide whether you accept Meher Baba and continue with me, or whether you reject Meher Baba, in which case I can no longer be your teacher. So we all went up to Fairfax, to the school 2-3 days after that. Elizabeth Patterson and Nerina Machiavelli and another very lovely, very elderly lady at that time, Mildred Kyle from Seattle. I don't know if that rings any bell at all with you. I think Mildred was in her late 80s, perhaps even early 90s at that point. We met them, and then Nerina Machiavelli gave an address on the nature of Meher Baba. Nerina Machiavelli was an extraordinary woman, extremely gifted, highly artistic, highly emotional, and I must confess that I probably have almost exactly the opposite temperament, reared through the university in sciences and mathematics, and sort of not accustomed to an emotional and a highly personalized approach to such things. So instead of being, let's say, solidly united, I had a tremendous problem immediately, and then certain writings and descriptions were passed around to the various different students of Murshid Martin. One of the first things that I found out was that Meher Baba had taken a vow of silence way back in 1925 and hadn't talked since. My gracious, you know, it's a very strange way to do things. And then I found out that nevertheless he communicated on an alphabet board. That got me rather upset. But I thought, well, so if he's going to communicate, why doesn't he do it straightforwardly, the natural, simple way? Why make it tough for oneself, you know? It just seemed like a needless thing to have to jump over. And then I began reading a few little stories about his having promised the people who were traveling with him that he'd break his silence in the Hollywood Bowl. And then he didn't. And why under the sun pick Hollywood Bowl of all places? You know, anybody in San Francisco thinks Southern California is just a creation of the devil and practically ready to drop off of the universe anyway. I mean, in those days, at least, we felt that way. Later on, San Francisco became, more liberalized than Southern California, but that was still in the future. So I began to have all of these problems associated with Mayor Baba and strange actions that just made absolutely no sense. What about all this business of the silence? And what about making promises and then not keeping promises? I mean, in the business world, if you had somebody that you were negotiating a contract with, and he gave you his word on something or another, then you get around for delivery time of the petroleum or whatever the commodity was, and it wasn't there, well, by gosh, you didn't have any more dealings. In fact, you probably hauled him into court. So you see, I had a big conflict of interest and of credulity that was involved here. So, dutifully, within 3 or 4 or 5 days, I trotted back over to Mercia de Martin and honestly explained to her that I was having all sorts of static. And she waded into me. My gosh, she really waded into me and asked me how under the sun I, at my picayune stage, trying to get my little toe beginning on the path, could judge somebody who had already traversed the path. How could I know what sort of characteristics and actions and ways of handling people he would go through? You know, her favorite expression, how can the drop measure the ocean? That sort of got home to me, but it still didn't answer these fundamental things. So I went back and I knew that there was absolutely no way that I was going to sort out these basic impasses between the manner in which I had been reared and the sort of things that Mayor Baba was merrily going on doing in his life. So I had to retreat from that. Excuse me for answering your 2 questions at such length. If I bore you, just say, look, we're getting pretty well along now, and we think we understand that. But to bring just a few more little points into it, I knew there was no way that I could resolve these head-on impasses, and so it resolved to something else. Although I certainly realized I was the drop, at least Mercia de Martin had to be a teacup. And if she, with her knowledge, her development, there's no question about that, if she said, for myself, I know that this is the great spiritual teacher of the age, then how else could I judge the subject? And so I just had to say to myself, if this is her decision, then I know it has to be basically right and sane, and I must trust that I will gradually sort these things out. But my trust and my love for the Mercida are the first. So I went back after 2 weeks and I said, Mercida, I've come to the conclusion that since you have accepted him, he must be what you say he is. And so I accepted him. She was very pleased. That was, as I say, in about 1945, and as you remember the history of Baba, he didn't come again to the Western world until 1952. He kept postponing. He had set a date and postponed. Well, you can imagine the agonies that always put me through, because I think, God, can't he make up his mind? Why doesn't he just wait to tell us when he's going to come until he really knows he's going to come? But one of the first things that I found out, being a Sufi, I had certain responsibilities. And at one particular time, those responsibilities, which were not given me by Mercia de Martin, but were in the nature of things, I was only able to get perhaps 4 or 5 hours sleep a night for months and months and months and months. And when I'd go to work, I'd be so tired out getting to work in the morning, but I didn't know how I'd get through 1 hour of my professional work, let alone 8 hours. And then I found out, I don't know exactly how, what gave me the idea, that if I would sit very, very quietly for the first hour, hour and a half, not saying anything, not speaking, that some way my forces within me would recoup and reknit. And that gave me just a tiny little bit of insight. I began to realize that speech has a tremendous force. It uses a tremendous amount of energy. And I began to think, my golly, if I were doing something which required extraordinary accumulation, concentration, and focus of energy in the world, and silence or some sort of utilization of silence would probably be a very important factor in it. Well, I wasn't at all sure whether this might have anything to do with Baba's silence, but I realized the connection between speech and one's own psychic energy. And then I began to see a few other little clues. It was very, very interesting, and I realized later on that obviously Baba was taking me in absentia through a gradual learning program. During the course of 7 years, either I realized answers inside of myself for every single doubt I had, or at least I was in a neutral position through my own learning in situations. So by the time Baba finally came to America again in 1952, I was either positively accepting certain things that he did, or at least I could take a neutral attitude. When I met him in New York, it didn't even take 1 second to know that this was the being of the most sublime nature and character that I'd ever been in contact with. And the second thing that I knew immediately was that he knew me in the most minute detail and accepted me in the most minute detail, more than I knew myself and more than I could ever accept myself. So not even 15 minutes of that first interview was necessary to realize the absolute authenticity of Merced Martin's original decision, and that this was the man who is my guide for all of my life, and probably many lifetimes. Have I answered your point? Do you want to discuss any of them further?
What level did you realize? Was it just
Instinctively internal. No question. As if it was something I'd always known and always lived with. It was so fundamental.
No longer based on belief, blind faith. It was experience.
It was an inner understanding and knowing of the quality of Baba and his relationship to me. Instantaneous. Yes.
I just wonder if sight played what part in those years.
Well, this, again, is an awfully good and a very, very basic question, because it's fundamentally the question that each of you who have not had sight come across. Let me say this, that in my own personal experience since Baba dropped the body, I've worked with, been close to, and close friend to many, 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 many young people, both in America and in Europe. And to watch, to experience with them the inner growing knowledge of the reality of Baba and his relationship to them, and the identity of Baba to their inner nature. The same experience that I had in the flesh. To see how that is established has been one of the most extraordinarily interesting things in my life. There are some individuals who come to that sense of inner identity in the presence of Baba very quickly, and there are many others who develop it over a period of what I would call learning in action. Maybe sight was important in the particular case. I rather think that Baba selected the moment of our being together to give me the certitude of himself and of our relationship. And I have seen that certitude happen completely without the sight of Baba. People who became aware of a Baba considerably long after he dropped his body. So I do not feel that sight is a necessary ingredient at all. I know it is not a necessary ingredient for many, 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 many people.
I would like to say something about that. The same experience that you had in Bob, it's the same experience I had in Bob's house when I got that out that Bob. Without ever having seen it. It was a momentary flash, that he was who he said he was, and that he loved me more than I could ever love myself. So I know that there are people who have some experience that having seen Bob.
Sure.
But it seems to me really important that the sight has nothing to do with the master anyway, because he says he's not the body. That the experience of seeing him is not what comes home.
This question is not necessarily intermediate because I knew Baba before he dropped the body. And I've always wondered, was there any importance in the people who had to know about Baba before he dropped? I mean, for them, you know what I'm saying? Was it a necessary thing to say? So I've always had that feeling about myself, that if I hadn't known about Baba in the body, I might never have come to him.
If you had known him,
If I hadn't known him in the body,
while he was still
while
in
he
the
was
body.
in the body, I don't know.
I doubt that would have been necessary. I mean, your timing, you're right to that type of a contact, you're right to a master, to a guide in your life, is something which depends upon your own inner timing. And whether or not Bob is in the body is really irrelevant. Well, do you mind if for my own sake, I take 2 minutes and just do a little bit of very, very dense, abstruse philosophy? And I apologize if this sort of reasoning doesn't appeal, but I would like to say what I know is the basis of the reality of this. Remember this, that Baba is God. Baba is a perfected one. As you know, perfection is something which is beyond material creation. It is outside of and beyond, because perfection is God. Always remember that Baba points out very clearly that everything that I know in my scientific background completely corroborates what Baba says in this area. Everything that our great modern physicists tell us completely corroborate these basic facts, that as you go from the densely material to the less material and the less material, you go into situations where time and space are more and more irrelevant. They are less and less present. And so an individual who is God, which means outside of materiality, completely beyond materiality, is absolutely unlimited by time and space. If this is true, Baba's dropping the body has so little to do with the reality of Baba and whatever he wants to do feels is necessary. He is beyond all space, he is beyond all time, he is beyond the limitation of all matter. This is why, for instance, Ned Foote in Washington can feel the immediacy and the presence of Baba at his shoulder in every detail of his life. And Mayor G. Karkari in Pune in India can have this identical sense of Baba participating in every moment of his life. And Adi Sr. and Ahmednagar can say the same thing. And Don Stevens sitting over in Madrid or hopping in an aeroplane to London can say very, very honestly exactly the same thing. And somebody said, how can a man be in so many places? You must all be deluded and dreaming. They are realities. I've had too many experiences and deep, pungent, realistic experiences relating to daily life to doubt this. This is not a bit of daydreaming. It is far from it. How? How can it be done? Simply because he has absolutely no binding in time and space. And this is why his having dropped the body has absolutely nothing to do with the forcefulness with which he contacts an individual when it is the right timing for that individual internally. He can contact, let us say, Charles today just as strongly as he could contact Charles when he was still in the body, when it is the right moment and the right internal timing for Charles.
What is your opinion of what is the music itself talking about what he did?
And in the silence, all right. Do you want me to tell you my own personal conviction on the silence and the breaking of the silence? Do you ever go back and read the Old Testament, in which it says, "And first there was the Word"? All right. If you stop to think of what the Word is, what under the sun is a word? Well, look, you go into a laboratory and look at what turns out. Was the Word, all right? Word is a disturbance in the air, it's in the atmosphere, it's a fundamental disturbance. But what was the whim of God when God had the whim to know himself? It was the disturbance in the infinite, unified existence of God himself. All of creation is a disturbance. It is a wave motion. Electricity is a wave motion. Radio is a wave motion. Atoms are wave motions, fundamentally, basically. Energy is a wave motion. A disturbance on a pond is a wave motion. And so when you say, first there was the Word, this is a very, very simple, very easily understandable, even quite primitive way of saying there was a disturbance. All right, so let's take it then the next step. All of creation is disturbances of one sort or another, of one type or another, and a word is a disturbance. So, if Baba is going to say the word, the only meaningful word to give all of creation a push, what this simply means is he puts an energy of disturbance into the situation, not necessarily an oral word. He increases the force and the strength of the disturbance so that it moves faster, it's got more impetus to it. And then I began thinking, as this began occurring, this all began to occur to me when I went back on one strange occasion and reread Genesis. And I was so struck by this statement, and first there was the Word. I said, gee, this has to relate to Meher Baba and the Word, the beginning of all creation. Then I began to think to myself, golly day, from the time that I was about 20 years old and first became deeply interested in mysticism and occultism and God knows what, I was aware, first, there were very few people in those days who were interested in it. Secondly, I was painfully aware, as the years went along, how slow the progress of these people were, how difficult it was to get anybody else even to dabble a little toe in the water of these fields. And what happens? All of a sudden, in the early 60s, the reverse happens. There is a tremendous surge of people who just automatically feel at home with these concepts. And just as soon as you lay out certain simple truths to them, they grasp them just as if they were old friends. They leap ahead and experience. And I said to myself, this must have been the great surge to creation, which it is the avatar's function to give. And if there is a real speaking of word, this is the real word, which gives this great surge of energy, this great boost to the complexity of experience in creation. If you plotted a graph, here is dear old humanity sort of gradually pulling itself up by its bootstraps internally in its own spiritual inner processes. All of a sudden, in the early 60s, that curve goes suddenly up like that. Well, if Baba was Baba, if he was the avatar, he had to be associated with that. And for me, the saying of the only word that is meaningful happened at precisely that point. For me, Baba broke his silence in the meaningful sense of the word considerably before he dropped the body. Yes?
Now, he does say, and I think it's in the Beloved, he says the word will be audible to your ears.
It was sure audible to my ears. Absolutely everybody was running around and screaming about spiritual truth. To me, it was audible within all of humanity at that point. But I'm quibbling with words now. Baba says so many things, which on the surface of it you say, well, that's the obvious interpretation. 10, 20 years later, all of a sudden, it strikes you and say, my God, now I see what that man meant in that. So I can't pretend just quickly to dive in and reconcile what you were saying there.
You related to when you said you finished the work. Did you correlate that point in your mind?
I believe that he gave that great push to creation, and especially to inner appreciation of the spiritual processes, starting in the relatively early 60s. Then I think I asked both Arish and Val about this when I was in India last August, because I was describing this little personal theory to them, and said, now, why under the sun, I said, to me, excuse me, I have to entangle one other little incident into this. I felt myself that because I became so aware of the intimate detail in which Baba was involved in my life, an extraordinary detail. So I said to Arish, I wonder if Baba didn't spend so much time in seclusion because for the first time the Avatar plotted out our individual lives in extraordinary detail. So is this the reason that Baba spent so much time in seclusion in the latter part of his life, even after I felt he had said the word? Arish said, no, Don, it's for a different reason, because this particular avataric incarnation is the end of a whole cycle. At the beginning of the cycle, the avatar is like a new chairman of the board of directors. He comes in all full of vim and vigor, you know. He's got a whole bunch of new projects for the corporation. And so he lays them out. And as he keeps coming back in as the avatar, it's sort of, let's say, like getting a new president or a new vice president or so on there. And he keeps giving pushes to these various different projects. But then when he comes to the end of that particular age, that's end of the cycle, these projects which he started at the beginning of the cycle, both Arish and Val gave exactly the same explanation. He then has an abnormally tedious, detailed rechecking of all of the progress that his special projects for that age have made, adjusting and finishing them off. So they said that was the reason Baba spent so much time in seclusion, especially right at the end of his life. So this, to me, Baba did all this rechecking after he had spoken the word, given the tremendous surge to creation, and then did the final checking of the chairman of the board to finish off that age. Interesting.
Don, can you talk a little bit about how God Speaks came about?
Yes. Baba had been giving, actually, for several years, in a very detailed, methodical manner, a great deal of material to Dr. Abdul Ghani Munsif. You remember he was a Muslim, close follower of Baba, an old schoolmate of Baba, in fact. And this was to be the material for God Speaks. It was supposed to be the description of the base of creation and man's role in creation. So then Baba came finally in 1952 to America. While he was here, I think it was actually while he was here, Dr. Ghani died. If it was not when Baba was actually here, it was soon after Baba returned. At any rate, very close to 1952. When Baba was here, he told Murshid Adus and myself that a book, which was to be God Speaks, although the name was not chosen, would be sent over for editing and that we should get it printed just as rapidly as possible. When Dr. Ghani died and Baba had one of the Mandali check the notes and what he had written up, Baba said, but he's misunderstood very, very important and key parts here. So, as a consequence, Baba had all of the Ghani manuscript set aside, and Baba himself dictated to Arish with on the alphabet board, dictated during the course of the day, God speaks. Arish took his notes, transcribed them at night, slept almost not at all, and then the next morning would check back what he had, taken from his notes and written up in detail, checked it back with Baba. Baba went through it meticulously, changed whatever needed to be changed, and then gave new material to Arish. So this went on for a period of several weeks. And then, as you know, Arish wrote the final chapter himself in God Speaks. Now then, Baba sent this manuscript, plus the original Dr. Ghani manuscript, over here to Murshid Adus and to myself. So he said, now, do what you want. I'm sending Ghani's manuscript to you. Make whatever use of it you want. Throw it away if you want it. Take parts of it from it if you want it. Use it however you want. So here were two manuscripts, the part that Arish had transcribed from Baba's direct dictation and the Ghani manuscript. Murshid Adus made the decision that there was a great deal of valuable material in the Ghani manuscript. She took that and said, I'm going to try to bring together the parts that seem to be most valuable. Don, you take the part that Arish transcribed direct from Baba, and we went our separate ways for several weeks. And then when we got back together in Washington, she had selected certain portions of the Muncie material and done the necessary editing on it while I'd been editing the fourth part. All of this was then sent to Baba as we had edited it. Baba reread it and said, fine, this is perfect, and this is what God need then publish.
What was the part from the other manuscript?
It is the appendix.
Huh?
In the original,
Is that the appendix?
that is the appendix. That is Abdul Ghani Munsi material taken from Baba, but reviewed by Baba for its correctness. That's the first appendix in the first edition. In the second edition, you know, there is a further second appendix of other material. This is not Munsi material.
Supplement?
The supplement. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What kind of change you have? What was valuable, what was not valuable?
Mm-hmm. Well, what of the Dr. Ghani Munsi's material Murshid Adus left out, I don't know, because quite frankly, when I got done the responsibility assigned to me, I was so corked that I didn't want to look at a word for months. But I can say, as far as what I did on the material dictated by Baba direct to Arish, which is, the God Speaks material, the only thing that I did was where there were inversions or awkwardnesses or an obvious misuse of an English word to change that. So we felt very, very, very strongly that one should not take liberties with Baba's word. This, incidentally, I think, is terribly important because there are so many people in working with material that has come from Baba, especially in translation work, I find nowadays, and I do get entangled into a good bit of this, where people feel that certain concepts that Baba has given out, either they're not clear, they feel, so they elaborate on them, or they feel that a certain viewpoint is not compatible with a certain culture of a certain country, and so they sort of adapt it to what they feel is more digestible. I feel personally this is absolute sheer dynamite. Point number two that Baba made indelibly clear to me, and I want to tell you about this because I think it's important for you. I'd like to leave with you just as much as I can, and as you will let me, of things that came direct to Baba, things that I think, that I know were terribly important to me. As you know, after, I'll go on with this point, after God Speaks, that was published, ready for the publishers in 55, as I recall. I went to India, and Baba gave me some material which formed the base of Listen Humanity. I worked another year and a half on that. And when it was published, I had a wonderful series of opportunities, both business-wise and vacation-wise, to keep going to India. I'd be there 3, 4, 5, 6 times a year. And so on one occasion when I was sitting in Mandalay Hall, just sort of, feeling happy and contented and pleased, all of a sudden, Baba looked at me and gestured. There he says, Don, Baba wants to know what you're doing about his words. About Baba's words. And then I suddenly realized, gee whiz, it's been months since I'd done any sort of editing work, and it's been months since I've even read anything that Baba's given out. I had a slight guilty conscience, You can't sit around lazy for any considerable period of time without starting to get a guilty conscience, particularly around Baba, because, he was a real taskmaster. You didn't sit around and suck your thumb very long around Baba. So I knew instantly that he somewhere or another was going to prod me, and I thought the only way to protect myself is to turn this into a compliment. So I had just the perfect compliment for Baba. I said, Baba, since finishing off Listen Humanity, I've just been enjoying the presence of Baba. And so Baba smiles and nods his head, and I thought, well, I got out of that scrape. But 20, 30 minutes later, Baba doesn't miss a trick. He knows when you're buttering him up and when you're trying to avoid the central point. So, you're going to get tired standing. Come on over. No. I'm not sure.
This is Tom.
Hello, Tom. So 20, 30 minutes later, Baba gets this sort of perplexed look on his brow again, and he has a way of doing that sort of a grimace and giving his head a couple of tosses like that. So here comes the thunderstorm. And I had a suspicion he was going to go back to this thing I'd tried to avoid. And he said, but really, Don, what are you going to do about Baba's words now? So I said, well, I might as well face up to it to myself. I said, Baba, I know I must go back and start studying your words again. He said, yes, do, Don. When you go back to San Francisco, select something and work at it. Continue with Baba's words. So I said, yes, I'll do that, Baba. I left. I don't think it was more than 2 or 3 months when I was, by great grace, back in India again, sitting at Baba's feet. First thing he did, Don, which of Baba's words have you been working on? Oh, dear God, I'd forgotten it absolutely completely. I hadn't read one blessed word of Baba's words. And so I confessed up right away, and I said, Baba, I'm terribly sorry. I just utterly forgot it. I didn't even try to say I'd been so busy. I just forgot. And so I said, all right, but Don, now do this time, promise Baba that you will. So I came back to San Francisco, and I got out the old Deshmukh edition of the Discourses, which I hadn't read, incidentally, for 7 or 8 years at that point.
Is this the 5-volume?
That's the little 5-volume work that preceded the 3 blue volumes. And I must confess to you that when I originally read the Discourses for the first time, I think it was long before I met Baba in the flesh, and I think probably I had not known of Baba more than 2 years at that time. And as I originally read those Discourses, once in a while something would make a little sense or leap out at me, but generally they were just something that I read mechanically because I felt it was my duty. But then here, 8, 9 years later, as I reread them for the second time in my life, my gosh, they were so pungent, they were so directly to the point, there were so many things that had enormous meaning to me. And I say, oh, I recognize that. Yes, that's an old friend. Gee whiz, yes, that's exactly how it happened. I hadn't thought of that, but what about it? So here were these statements of Baba which had enormous meaning to them. So I went back and right away, immediately as I came in, Baba said, all right, Don, now what have you done with Baba's words? And I said, well, I've reread the Discourses, and Baba, they're fabulous. And I said, I have a suspicion that for the young people who are now beginning to study more philosophy and religions and so on, that these are going to be their natural approach to you. But Beshmuk's use of English is not American or English usage, and about half of one's attention was absorbed in trying to quickly resort things, and the other half occupied with a real meaning. So I said, Baba, would you let me take those and re-edit them? He said, yes, if you'd like. Go talk to Adi Senior because he has the rights to them. And Adi said, yes, wonderful. So I worked for a year and a half on those. But at that point, when Baba said yes, he said to me, now Don, I want to tell you something very, very basically. You must continue to work with Baba's words that he has given out. He said, because they have a force, they have a power, which is of tremendous help to people, and urge other people to do this. And this is why everywhere I've been ever since, I have always done something, let's say, like a discourse group or a God Speaks group or something of this sort. Because it took Baba, this is the only time in all of my contacts with Baba in which he referred back to a subject 3 separate times before stupid old Stevens finally got the message and realized that Baba was driving at something of fundamental importance. And he said, and urge others to do it, because they have a force which will be of great help to them. I always think of it in my own mind because I'm one of those dismal people who can only think in mechanical model concepts. To me, it's as if Baba, as the avatar, each time he gives a word, he attaches to it a small atom bomb of energy, of spiritual energy. And you and I, when we tap those words, even if forgive me for being so blunt about this, even if we don't understand the concepts of those words, when we tap those words, we tap into some part of that atomic energy that he's associated with it, the avataric push. This I know is true, because I've been around and seen the repercussions on people over the course of time now. So, I would all urge you, if you want to profit by Baba, one thing to do, and I don't say the only thing to do, but one thing to do, choose a couple of minutes or 5 minutes or so on a regular basis and sit yourself down and feel into a little bit Baba's direct words. There are a lot of statements around in the literature that we don't have Baba's direct words. This is nonsense. We do have Baba's direct words because he showed me, he had Arish show me in Baba's presence exactly how Baba had, for instance, given out the discourses, how he gave out God's speech, how he gave out the messages to the public whenever he would travel to Europe and to the West, so that I knew personally the meticulous care with which Baba gave and reviewed the material. So don't ever let anybody give you the idea that we do not have Baba's direct words. We do.
Talking about the book, what is your opinion about the book?
The book?
Yeah.
I think this is one of Baba's great red herrings, which he has deliberately planted to focus attention on the avatar. And I think this was one of the great reasons for his silence also, as a means of focusing real attention on. Even if you're mad as hops at him, because you say this is ridiculous, it causes you to focus on him. And unconsciously, unwittingly, you absorb the book, the famous Bible that's been lost. This was it, wasn't it?
Yeah, that's it.
It's supposed to have disappeared. And some guys say, oh, obviously, he's got it. Oh, no, she has it locked in a box in the bank. I know it.
Aren't there some people, though, who Baba showed parts of the book to?
I don't think so.
Adi
Ned,
Senior says that he has seen things
he has,
that Bob
hasn't.
showed. And he also said he couldn't remember a word that he read.
Good, honest man.
I've heard that a couple of times, and some people, I think he showed Indira Gandhi some of the book too. I never read that.
Well, I know. The only thing I remember
Mine
was seeing
too.
and Harry Truman.
I don't want to see it. It does that for
No, remember his contact was with Mahatma Gandhi.
That's what I'm sorry. I meant.
But it was a personal contact.
That was on the boat.
Yes, on the boat.
I can swear
I read that too.
Yes, print of the
See, I'm
book
not
has
crazy,
in
then
it
he
that
had
he showed
to
him,
go something.
he showed him several pages. It doesn't specify what the book is.
When was it that he was on the boat, and when was it he was supposed to have written?
32, wasn't it, that he was on the boat with Gandhi? Somewhere roughly there.
31, 32, I wrote the book in 26 and 27. He wrote the book in 1925, 6 and 7.
Supposedly he sat in the cellar, part of the tomb,
A little cracker box thing.
and nobody ever saw it.
He used to carry around big iron boxes for a lot of his travel. I don't know if he was talking about
It was kept in a locked box in a bank for quite a long time. When Baba dropped the body, I got there 24 hours after Baba dropped his body. The first thing I asked Arish, you have Baba's Bible? He said, no, just down in the locked box in Bombay. I mean, yeah, right. And Adi Sr. said exactly the same thing. And then, I guess it was 2-3 weeks later when I got back to London, I got a letter saying, good heavens, Don, do you know anything about it? Because it isn't there. And so, I mean, the Mandali, as close to Mandali as Arish himself, was absolutely convinced there it was. And it wasn't. And he said, well, obviously, Baba gave the key and the right to take it out to somebody else. But who it was, who knows?
But then it's not just an imaginary thing. It probably is, in fact, a book.
Oh, it is a book, and the Mandali know. I mean, they have seen this tied up package in this strong box.
Well, the last story was that Dr. Wilson had it, and it was stolen from him by one of the boys. It was over in a rock pile somewhere, according to our famous lady out west. Find it.
I see. Well.
And Ned hasn't let anyone into his library in 4 years.
Yes.
John, can you clear up for me one of these that Baba said about politics and reconciling, remembering, and I don't know the exact words, but it seems to me that Baba said not to be involved in politics.
Well, let us put it this way, triangulating in on a number of different comments that Baba has given out, parts of conversations that I participated in, it comes down to Baba's pointing out to us that to do a fundamental work of righting, correcting ills in the world, it is necessary to go to the base of the ills. Baba always pointed out that if we try to tackle, let us say, society's ills by devising a new political system, or a new economic system, or a new educational system, or a new social system, that all of these are at a secondary level, and that they are doomed to failure if we do not dive to the deeper level, which is man's knowledge of his own relationship to God. We must put, let's say, the first part of the structure into place. So Baba says that the spiritual student should not waste his time and energy on the secondary levels of things, but dive to the base and then let these things flow from a healthy base.
I have a question. I'm sorry.
You escaped all of them.
Yeah, I was thinking about that. Why don't we do this? Let's say, 2 more questions, and we sort of, and then we just sort of chitter-chatter informally for a while.
Yeah, I have a question about the rhythms of life and the flow of pleasure and pain, and how those components play in terms of learning, in terms of your own life. Well, for me, I find the most learning takes place during pain, and yet in the pleasurable times, I experience as respite from the pain, and then is that pretty much
remember one thing, and again, I hope you don't feel that I'm prejudiced or loony. I know deeply that Baba himself plans out for each one of us in extraordinary detail the events of our lives related to our own inner pattern and karma. So there is not a single event that happens in your life which was not plugged into place for some particular need that you have internally. All right. If you accept that, then, if you can accept that as being a basic fact of life and a truth of considerable importance, then what this means is when you get into a tight or a difficult or a painful situation, the first thing that you do is you say to yourself, all right, here's a learning lesson from Baba, and somewhere or another I've got to mine that out. That's point one. So instead of putting yourself in an opposition to the situation, you look in cooperation to get something out of that. Then secondly, you ask Baba, and here I think, please let me give you one of the most fundamental things that I feel is necessary, and that is out loud prayer. This, I think, is one of the most fundamental tools for the individual's own internal ongoing prayer at the moment, right in the situation, and out loud. If you're in the middle of a bunch of people, for heaven's sake, go over and get into a quiet corner or up a side street somewhere and have a quick, out loud, prayerful conversation with Baba. And say, Baba, help me, give me the strength to understand what is going on and what you are trying to teach me. So first of all, you recognize the situation as given to you by Baba as a learning situation, and you turn to Baba quickly to get the insight and the power to go through that situation. If you do that, you shorten the period of learning, and you enormously decrease the pain associated with it. Believe me, I know this is true. Try those two techniques. Yeah. Why out loud? I don't know the rule. I don't know the reason for that, but I know it's necessary.